After the 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century, Russia strengthened their ties with their old enemies, Britain and Prussia. This was the statesman Nikita Panin's Northern Plan, which focused on uniting the northern states against the French and the Austrians. However, in 1768, the Polish rebelled against the Russian influence in their domestic policies. The Ottomans came to the aid of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but the Russians emerged victorious and expanded south into Crimea. So Catherine the Great's new advisor, Prince Potemkin, turned Russia's attention south, hoping to gain access to the Mediterranean and even to restore the Byzantine Empire. So they decided to sign an alliance with the Austrians in 1781 and went to war against the Turks. But the French Revolution distracted Austria and very little territory changed hands. However, it still demonstrated that the Ottomans' power had considerably declined. Amongst other causes, this decline was a result of the Europeans finding new trade routes to Asia, plus the Janissaries threatened to stage a coup if the Sultan modernized the army structure that they thrived in, and decentralization meant people far from Constantinople could rule nearly independently, like the Serbs, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, Greeks, and their two vassal states, Wallachia and Moldavia. Napoleon tried to exploit their weakness by invading Egypt, and the Austrians aided a Serbian rebellion. Plus, the Russians went to war against the Ottomans in 1806 after the Sultan deposed the pro-Russian rulers of Wallachia and Moldavia. Despite their military defeats during this war, the Janissaries rose up against Selim III's military reforms, and they eventually lost Bessarabia to the Russians and had to recognize the autonomy of Serbia. Meanwhile, the Russians were also expanding south through a series of war against Persia, and they would eventually go on to take most of the Caucasus from them. But after the Napoleonic Wars, the European powers sought to maintain peace by keeping the status quo. However, this was challenged when the Greeks rose up in 1821. Tsar Alexander I didn't become involved as he sought to maintain the new peace, but when Nicholas I came to the throne, he decided to strike the Ottomans in 1828, hoping to exploit their weakness and support the Greeks. This, however, worried many, in particular Britain, who were already suspicious of Russia's expansion into Asia, and this, the Great Game, would sour Anglo-Russian relations throughout the 19th century. So the British aided Greece, putting them under their influence, while Metternich and Austria tried to form an anti-Russian alliance. So the Russians made peace just a year later, taking some territory along the Black Sea, and gained influence in Moldavia and Wallachia. And with the major powers now against them, the Russians decided to turn the Ottomans into a dependency instead of taking land. And the opportunity for this came in 1831. Muhammad Ali of Egypt was promised control of Cyprus and Crete for helping in the Greek Revolution, but when he didn't get them, he went to war against the Sultan. The Russians agreed to help the Sultan, but forced him to close the Turkish straits to foreign warships if Russia was under threat. This again worried the British and French, who persuaded Muhammad Ali to sue for peace. The Ottomans tried to reclaim their lost territory in 1839, but again were defeated militarily. So the great powers got involved again and forced Muhammad Ali's Egypt to remain part of the Ottoman Empire. And they also forced the Ottomans to open the straits to any of their allies during a war, weakening the Russians' position once again. Meanwhile, the Ottomans through Tanzimat began introducing a series of liberal reforms, and they also had disbanded the Janissary Corps. But the rebellions continued, like in Bosnia in 31, Pirot 36, Nice 41 and Albania 47. However, the Ottomans didn't experience large revolutions in 1848 like the rest of Europe did. The people of Moldavia and Wallachia rose up against the Russians, but the Russians still decided to help the Austrians in crushing their revolts, hoping they'd help out in a future war. This was tested when, in the 1850s, the French and the Russians demanded the rights to defend the Christian holy places in the Middle East. The Ottomans eventually gave the rights to France, so the Russians went to war, starting the Crimean War. Britain and France joined the Ottomans, while the Austrians not only refused to help Russia, but threatened to enter the war against them. So Russia lost and had to open up the Black Sea to foreign ships, and withdraw from Wallachia and Moldavia. But the major powers pushed the Ottomans into accepting the unification of the states, forming Romania. Plus, during the war, the Ottomans took out loans from Western powers, and in 1858 the Montenegrins, who had long acted independently, beat the Ottomans to establish internationally recognized borders. This is how the situation remained until the Prussians won the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. This resulted in a new republic in France and the creation of a German empire. The Russians quickly entered into an alliance with the Germans and Austrians as part of the League of Three Emperors, and the new French Republic was not as open to defending the Ottomans, so Britain was left alone in stopping Russian expansion. And this came just before the Herzegovinians rebelled in 1875, which started the Great Eastern Crisis.